I spent 81 years running from a name I was taught to fear. For 8 decades, I carried the weight of tradition, the burden of history, and the quiet shame of questions I was too afraid to ask. But on a cold winter morning, holding my granddaughter's hand in a hospital chapel, everything I thought I knew shattered, and the truth I'd been avoiding my entire life finally found me.
My earliest memories are painted in the warm amber glow of Shabbat candles and the rich, comforting smell of my mother's challah bread rising in our small Brooklyn kitchen. I was born in 1945, just months after the war ended, into a world still bleeding from wounds too fresh to speak about. My father came to America with numbers tattooed on his forearm and nightmares that woke him screaming in languages I didn't understand. He never talked about the camps. Not really. But he taught me everything I needed to know through his silence, through the way his jaw clenched when we passed a church, through the fierce pride with which he wrapped his tefillin each morning. We survived because we remembered who we are, he told me once, his calloused hand gripping my shoulder. Never forget, David. They tried to erase us. Our job is to remain. So I remained. I studied Torah. I kept kosher. I married a good Jewish girl named Rachel, whose laugh could light up the darkest room. We raised 3 children in the same neighborhood where I grew up, teaching them the same lessons my father taught me. Be proud. Be separate. Hold tight to your identity because it's the only thing they can't take from you. I thought I had it all figured out. I thought the structure, the rituals, the ancient prayers in a language I barely understood, I thought all of it was enough. For decades it was enough. I found comfort in the predictability, in the unbroken chain of tradition stretching back thousands of years. I was a link in that chain, and that gave my life meaning. But somewhere in my 70s, after Rachel got sick and the house grew quieter, something shifted. It started small, a restlessness during services, a distraction during prayers I'd recited 10,000 times. I'd catch myself staring at the Ark, at the Torah scrolls dressed in their velvet coverings, and feeling empty, hungry for something I couldn't name. I started reading more, searching for answers in the texts I thought I knew by heart. Late at night, when the house was silent and sleep wouldn't come, I'd pull books from shelves I hadn't touched in years. I told myself I was deepening my faith, strengthening my understanding. But the truth was, I was looking for something that the endless repetition of ritual had stopped providing. And then I found myself doing something I'd never done before, something that would have horrified my father. I started reading books about him, about Jesus. I hid them in the back of my closet like contraband, pulling them out only when I was certain I was alone. The first time I saw his name in Isaiah 53, I actually gasped out loud. I was sitting in my study on a Tuesday afternoon. Rachel was at her sister's house, and the winter sun was slanting through the window, illuminating the Hebrew text in a way that made the words seem to glow on the page. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. I'd read this passage before, dozens of times, maybe hundreds, but I'd always skimmed over it, never really letting the words sink in. The rabbis at shul had their explanations, their interpretations about Israel as the suffering servant. But as I sat there that afternoon, something in my chest cracked open. Who was this really about? This person pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The description was so specific, so detailed, so personal. It read like an eyewitness account of something that hadn't happened yet when Isaiah wrote it. Or had it. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. What was I doing? What was I thinking? This was dangerous territory, the kind of questioning that led people away from their families, their communities, their entire identities. I thought of my father, of what he would say if he could see me now, entertaining these thoughts. I thought of the disappointed looks from the men at synagogue, the whispered conversations that would follow me everywhere. But I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. The words had lodged themselves in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Rachel passed away 6 months later. Pancreatic cancer, swift, merciless, unstoppable. One day, she was complaining about indigestion, and 3 months later, I was sitting shiva, accepting condolences from a parade of well-meaning people whose words meant nothing to me. They quoted Psalms. They reminded me that she was with God now. They brought brisket and kugel and their presence, as if proximity to grief could somehow lighten it. I appreciated their efforts, I really did, but in the depths of my mourning, surrounded by all the rituals meant to comfort the bereaved, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The prayers I'd said every day since childhood became hollow sounds, empty syllables that echoed in the cavern of my grief without touching the sides. I'd wake at 3 in the morning, the other side of the bed cold and empty, and wonder what it had all been for. The decades of tradition, the careful observance, the pride in our heritage. Where was God in all of it? Where was the comfort I'd been promised? Where was Rachel? One night, about 2 months after she died, I found myself back in my study, unable to sleep, unable to cry anymore, unable to do anything but sit in the darkness and feel the weight of 76 years pressing down on my chest. Almost without thinking, I pulled out one of those forbidden books I'd hidden away, a commentary on the Gospel of John written by a Messianic Jew. I told myself I was just curious. I told myself it was research, intellectual exploration, nothing more. But as I read about this Jesus who wept at his friend's tomb, who felt the full weight of human grief, something in me responded. Here was someone who understood suffering not as an abstract theological concept, but as a lived, visceral reality. The months that followed Rachel's death became a strange double life I'd never imagined living. By day, I was David Rosenberg, the devoted grandfather, the regular at morning minyan, the man who could always be counted on to make the 10th for a prayer quorum. I showed up. I participated. I nodded at the appropriate moments and said, "Amen," when expected. But at night, alone in the house that still smelled faintly of Rachel's perfume, I was someone else entirely. Someone who asked questions that had no safe answers. Someone who read passages about a Messiah who had already come, who had walked the streets of Jerusalem, who had claimed to be the fulfillment of everything we'd been waiting for. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. I'd sit in services, listening to prayers for the Messiah's coming, and think, what if he already came? What if we missed him? What if we're still waiting for someone who's been here all along? But I couldn't speak these thoughts aloud. Not to my children, who had their own families and their own faith to maintain. Not to my friends at synagogue, who would have looked at me with a mixture of pity and horror. Not to anyone. The loneliness of those secret questions was almost worse than the grief of losing Rachel. Then Emma came into my life in a new way. She'd always been special. My youngest granddaughter. Sarah's daughter, 7 years old, with curls that bounced when she ran and questions that never stopped. But after Rachel died, Emma seemed to sense that I needed her visits more than ever. Her mother would drop her off on Sunday afternoons, and we'd spend hours together, this old man and this curious child, navigating our different forms of grief. She missed her grandmother terribly. I could see it in the way she'd touch Rachel's favorite chair, in how she'd ask if Grandma could see her from heaven. And I'd answer with the platitudes I'd been taught, the comfortable assurances about the world to come, even as my own faith in those answers crumbled like old parchment. It was a Sunday in early December, when everything changed. Emma arrived wearing a red coat, her cheeks pink from the cold, carrying a construction paper menorah she'd made at school. We made hot chocolate, hers with extra marshmallows, mine with a splash of whiskey I thought she wouldn't notice, and settled into our usual spots in the living room. "Grandpa," she said, her voice suddenly serious in that way children get when they're about to ask something they've been thinking about for a long time, "why don't we celebrate Christmas like my friends at school?" Then she looked up at me with those enormous brown eyes, Rachel's eyes, and asked the question that would shatter my carefully constructed world. "But Grandpa, if Jesus loved everyone, why can't we love him back?" I stared at this child, this innocent 7-year-old who had no idea what she was asking, what doors she was opening, what 8 decades of fear and tradition she was challenging with her simple, devastating logic. I should have had an answer ready. I'd spent my entire life preparing responses to questions like this, defending our faith, explaining our separation, justifying our distinctiveness. But sitting there with Emma's question hanging in the air between us, surrounded by the life I'd built on the foundation my father had laid, I found I had nothing to say. That's complicated, sweetheart," I finally managed, my voice rougher than I intended. She tilted her head, studying me with that unnerving perception children sometimes have. "But love isn't complicated, Grandpa. You always tell me that." You say love is the simplest thing in the world. She was right, I had said that. Many times. After she left that evening, I sat in my chair until well past midnight, unable to move, unable to think about anything except her question. Why can't we love him back? 7 words from a 7-year-old, and they'd demolished walls I'd spent 81 years building. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I got down on my knees, not an easy feat at my age, and I prayed differently than I'd ever prayed. Not the memorized prayers in Hebrew, not the structured liturgy I could recite in my sleep. Just talking to God, the real God. Not the God of my tradition or my father's trauma or my community's expectations, just God. I don't know what I'm doing, I whispered into the darkness of my bedroom. I don't know if this is betrayal or homecoming. But I need to know the truth, whatever it costs me. Show me. Please. I wept that night like I hadn't wept since Rachel's funeral. Maybe harder. Because this wasn't just grief. It was 81 years of questions I'd been too afraid to ask, fears I'd been too proud to admit, hunger I'd been too loyal to acknowledge. 3 weeks later, Sarah called me at 6 in the morning, her voice tight with panic. Emma had collapsed at home, high fever, unresponsive. They were rushing her to Mount Sinai Hospital. Could I meet them there? I've never dressed faster in my life, I've never prayed more desperately during a car ride, and I've never felt more helpless than I did sitting in that hospital waiting room, watching my daughter pace back and forth, her face grey with fear while doctors ran tests and spoke in hushed tones about infections and complications and words no grandfather should have to hear. For 3 days Emma lay in that hospital bed, tiny and pale against the white sheets, monitors beeping their steady rhythm while we waited. My son and other daughter flew in. We took turns sitting with her, holding her small hand, talking to her even though she couldn't respond. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but I could see the worry in their eyes. I barely slept. I couldn't eat. I sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair and bargained with God in ways that surprised even me. Take me instead, I whispered. She's 7 years old. She has her whole life ahead of her. Take me. I've had my time. On the morning of the 3rd day, I found myself walking the hospital corridors at dawn, unable to sit still any longer. My feet carried me without conscious direction until I found myself standing outside a small chapel on the 2nd floor. I'd passed it dozens of times over the past 3 days, but never went in. Now I pushed open the door. It was empty, simple, non-denominational. The kind of space designed to offend no one and comfort everyone. But my eyes immediately went to the wooden cross on the far wall. Simple, unadorned, just 2 pieces of wood joined together. In a hospital full of sophisticated medical equipment, this primitive symbol seemed almost out of place. I walked toward it slowly, my footsteps echoing on the tile floor. And then, standing in front of that cross, alone with God and my fear and my desperation, I finally stopped running. Jesus, I whispered. Just his name. The name I'd been taught to fear, to avoid, to speak only in warnings. But now it came out like a prayer, like a confession, like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. I don't understand all of this. I don't know what it means for my family, for my identity, for everything I've believed. But Emma was right. If you loved everyone, if you love me, I want to love you back. I'm not asking you to prove anything. I'm just asking you to be real, to be here, to be who those prophets said you were. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. 81 years of resistance, of fear, of loyalty to everything except the truth, all of it poured out of me in that empty chapel. I wasn't betraying my father's memory. I was honoring the God my father had survived the camps to worship. I wasn't abandoning my people. I was embracing the Messiah my people had been waiting for. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for the sun to fully rise, for the hospital to wake up around me, for something fundamental in my soul to shift and settle into place. When I finally walked back to Emma's room, Sarah met me in the hallway, her face transformed. "Dad," she said, grabbing my hands. She woke up, just now. The fever broke. The doctors can't explain it, but she's asking for you. I entered that room and saw Emma sitting up in bed, still weak but smiling, her curls matted against her head. "Hi, Grandpa," she said softly. I kissed her forehead, holding her small hand in both of mine, feeling the warmth of her living, breathing presence. And I knew, with a certainty that transcended explanation or logic, that something had changed, not just in Emma's body, but in the deepest part of who I was. At 81 years old, I finally found what I'd been searching for my entire life. The Messiah wasn't coming. He had already come. He'd been there all along, waiting patiently for me to stop running, to stop hiding behind tradition and fear and loyalty, to everything except truth. I can't explain what happened to Emma in medical terms, and I don't need to. I can't predict how my family will react when I find the courage to tell them, and I've made peace with that uncertainty. I don't have all the answers to the questions that will come, from my children, from my community, from the life I've known. But I know this. A 7-year-old girl asked me why we couldn't love Jesus back, and in answering her question, I found the answer to every question I'd been too afraid to ask. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to see what's been in front of you all along. Sometimes it takes losing everything you thought defined you to discover who you really are. And sometimes the God you've been waiting for has been waiting for you just as long, with more patience and love than you ever dared to imagine. My name is David Rosenberg. I'm 81 years old, I'm Jewish, and I've found my Messiah. He was worth the wait.